Liccardo is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for your testimony and for taking the time to help educate us, myself in particular. I know this is a fast-moving area, and I really had questions targeting really primarily Dr. Cox and Dr. Lee. I'd be interested in your views. We have several concepts that have been presented in legislation here before us, and I wanted to see if there was, I'd like to tinker a little bit with a couple of these bills from Chairman Hill, the sandbox concept, and from my colleague, Congresswoman Pedersen, the task force concept, and combine them in a way if we could. I represent Silicon Valley. Obviously, we have a lot of concerns, or I hear lots of concerns in my neck of the woods about having government involved in regulating the code and the algorithms, particularly since government isn't terribly good at it. And we'd expect that the technology is evolving so quickly we won't be good at it. But on the other hand, I think there's a widespread embrace of the notion that we need to be mitigating the worst of the harms. And so the question would be, if we were to create perhaps even more than a task force, but an independent body of folks in industry, academics, experts, financial regulators, and others, that were to establish what the best practices are in the industry. The best practices around, for example, curated data sets. I know you mentioned, Doctor, that IBM utilizes it, or testing and reporting, or fraud detection, watermarking, data security, a whole host of best practices in the industry, and then hold that up as the standard and establish essentially that is going to be the negligence standard, or essentially the standard. If everyone complies with that standard, then you are exempt from liability. If you're not meeting that best practices standard, then good luck with the lawyers and the regulators. What about an approach that would combine those two? And I'd ask either Dr. Lee or Dr. Cox would like to jump in.
So I'll jump in first.
Yeah.
So I think that is a tremendous idea that we should consider, because we seem to be at the same stalemate every time we talk about these issues. There's a technical side of it, and then there's this consumer output. And I do think that government regulators are good at the latter, the consumer protection side of it, because guess what? That's the side where our constituents are coming to us and saying something has harmed me. With regards to what you're saying, I would just like to offer to you that we did start that process under the previous administration. The AI blueprint for a Bill of Rights was actually a nice glide path for getting to the same protections that you're speaking of, as well as collaboration. The executive order, which was soon after appended, had a lot of that conversation on how do you actually bring different bodies together from various disciplines, industry sectors, government, and civil society, so that we actually solve this together. To date, we've seen a lot of that sort of eroded in the new administration, as well as in the AI action plan, where we're primarily competing against ourselves when we actually just see China as our only force of nature. So I would suggest, I agree with you. I think there has to be more conversation, more collaboration, more disclosure among the various entities to get to the space that you're talking about. And I think a task force would not be a bad idea. That was also recommended under the prior administration.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Cox?
I think that there are some interesting things emerging already. So the ISO 42001 standard for just the entire creation process of a large language model is, one example of something emerging, and I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of how these things are playing out. It's a voluntary standard; you get audited against it, and it's some sort of mark of your, whether you have the proper hygiene there. Now, that's different than regulating the algorithm, though, right? Like it's more about regulating processes and controls, and documentation and auditing, as opposed to saying this technology, this algorithm's intrinsically worrisome somehow. And I think that's one thing that I think many of the panelists have raised, is that it's nothing intrinsic about the technology. It's about how are you using it. It always has to be in the context of how it's being used, and we have use and risk-based regulation. That's a normal thing we already have. So combining that with things like cybersecurity hygiene standards, which are now then being transported to the world of AI, I think that's an evolution of what we already have to a good outcome.
Thank you. Thank you both.